Why should anyone ever think it's justifiable to want to literally own parts of someone else? Like the way that many of these dealers talk about them, it's a weird double-edged sword. We admit these are people, like, you just treat them with respect, they're people, and yet they'll still sell them to whoever has the best price, sell them to the highest bidder.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionist Podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. Damien Hooper. He has a BA in Archaeology and Anthropology from the University of Arizona. He's done his Master's in Archaeology and his PhD in Osteoarchaeology from the Australian National University. He's the co-founder and a board member for the Alliance of Countercrime Online. He's currently a researcher at the Museum of Looted Antiquities and a research fellow in the Wildlife Crime Research Hub at the University of Adelaide. He's here today to talk to us about the sale of human remains online. We'll get into that in a minute, but I have a few other questions for him first. So welcome to the show, Damien.
Thanks, Megan. Good to be here. Thanks for making time with the time zone differences we have. But
yes, for anyone unaware, I'm in Ireland. You are in Australia. It is quite a time difference.
It is. There's many hours difference, but not too late, fortunately. So I still have functioning brain cells at this time of night.
we can power through.
Yeah, all good.
So I wanted to ask you, first of all,
Sure.
You are the co-founder and a board member for the Alliance to Counter Crime Online.
Yep.
So what is that and what is their mission?
Sure. Okay. Well, ACO, as we call ourselves, we started in 2018, where 7 of us with backgrounds in academia or journalism or industry, assortment of perspectives for research and advocacy. We'd all been working on our own separate sectors or areas of online organized crime research, or the trafficking or various goods, people, or things, or other types of dodgy behavior across social media platforms. Me and a colleague, Sean Graham, was human remains. Others, antiquities, wildlife, animal cruelty videos. Some regarded to child protection and child sexual assault material. Really dark stuff. And just collectively, we all got introduced to each other. We were seeing each other's work pop up either in the media or in publications. We realized, you know what? There's no collective organization, at least in the NGO space, that is trying to say all these problems, the common enemy, the common issue is all these problems are occurring on the same platforms by many of the same tricks, by use of the same algorithmic modification, algorithmic amplification, as they call it. And because of the failures to moderate and control or do anything by these platforms, not just meta platforms, but others too, e-commerce, other forms of social media across the board. Said we all kind of feel like we're in our vacuum or in kind of a silo. We know there's so many more people and organizations doing work in these spaces, and we're all collectively, we should be trying to push the ball uphill to raise awareness, to advocate for legal and policy change, especially in the US of 2018, when things in this space seemed more promising and had more possible potential to affect the reforms of the laws. And in that milieu, in that time, he said, all right, let's come together as an NGO. And that's why we founded ACCO for that mission. So we're the current, mostly the same founding members and board members now are the ones that were there. And then we have 40 plus partner organizations, NGOs, or individuals around the world who we have a network with. It's not a paid thing. It's not, as many in the NGO space understand, it's always a quest for funding, for doing the good work, getting being that bridge between research and public advocacy and policy. But yeah, we've been pushing and trying to advance the reality that you know the common problem is how the platforms are run, how they're not really overseen or controlled, and that because of that, they allow things like human race trafficking, many forms of wildlife trafficking, etc. In my case with the boat trades, it's really a good example of a problem that would not would have been incredibly obscure, would have been a niche of a niche of the antiquities trade. And with collectors and sellers distributed all over the world, it's very, very difficult to actually make transactions and reach each other. If it weren't for the internet, and especially if it weren't for social media, whereas other problems like human trafficking, romance scams, child sexual abuse, while they have a much bigger scope, they've been known for a much longer time, but they still, you see it time and time again, these problems amplify and get worse because of the way these platforms act or don't act. And so that's at the heart of NACO's mission. And what we try to do is just get knowledge of this, data driven knowledge in front of politicians, lawyers, of course, the public especially, but also the school groups in Western and non Western countries to go right to the potential victims of exploitation of some of these online crimes or in communities that would be, you know, the front line of, you know, deciding do they or do they not actively choose to participate in wildlife crime, even if do they know it's wildlife crime, do they know what all the knock-on effects and all the massive price increases that occur when smuggled antiquities, smuggled remains, smuggled whatever wildlife move from the people who extract the material to the middleman who get a higher price to the collector who get the highest price in these sales or these deals. Like we try and cover a lot of different bases as a, but ACO is really these days at least, especially in the current milieu and climate of the U.S., which is I don't have to tell you, become kind of a nightmare. And of course, the global effects of that nightmare are being felt around the world. So now we see our role as kind of an umbrella where we can support each other. We can, partner organization members can liaise. We can share research information uh, between organizations, between NGOs, under kind of the ACO umbrella. And then for those of us who are in academia or are still doing our own actual publishable research, then we also try to use the ACO network that we have to get members new work, new research, and new publications more quickly into spaces beyond standard academic spaces.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it
Well,
does. And it's very interesting to me. I was taking a look at your website earlier, which
yeah,
I will link in the description for
good.
anyone interested. But the sort of collection of things that you guys look at, like it's not
Mm,
just human remains, which obviously we're here to
no.
discuss, but as you're
Mm,
saying, like wildlife, like exploitation of
mm,
children and vulnerable adults, and like all these other things, and just the kind of how you're using like research backed, opinions to say like
mm,
this is what's
mm,
happening. Here's the
mm,
numbers and figures behind
mm.
it. Like,
And
yeah, it's very interesting.
we make or we have made between 2018 and now, and you can find that, and your listeners can find those on the website of ACDO as well. A number of fact sheets about each of these types of or categories of trafficking or online crime as we see them, as we understand them through our both through in some senses, in some instances, our own research that we've done for ACO written reports that have been researched and compiled to uh, be more directly available to policymakers and to legislators in the US and the EU and a little bit in Australia, but mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's at the heart of the goal as well is because all these platforms are, for the most part, U.S. headquartered, then they all fall under the legal liability field, we call it, of, and you can find more on the website. The United States Section 230, Communications and Decency Act. They call it the 16 words that made the internet. And it basically, it gives any kind of internet service, internet platform of any type, commerce or not, a broad legal protection against any user or third party member um, suing it or bringing any kind of action against the platform because of harmful content or whether that's racism, you know, exploitation, assault, trafficking, stalking. It it's this legal barrier that's been in place because of this law and because the platforms are U.S. based. This applies to anywhere in the world that anyone is using these platforms. So they're all
Hmm.
global platforms, and all the networks that we talk about for all these kinds of crimes, they're all global because of these platforms. But they fall under, at least in this sense, they're protected by this bit of U.S. law. Even if other countries like the EU or Australia make and pass their own laws to try and regulate social media and e-commerce in their own jurisdictions, this specific issue that we feel is pretty central to why many categories of organized crime can flourish globally, digitally across the spaces, it has to change in the US itself. The reform has to
Hmm.
happen in the US, and now this 2025 has arrived, things are rather complicated in the US. So that's
Yeah.
also a big part of ACO's mission, and it has been from the beginning.
Mm. It does, it makes sense that, like, yeah, obviously it doesn't matter how many individual countries introduce laws around things
Mm,
if the country you're based in is protecting you, like,
mm.
no one can touch you from the outside,
Yeah,
really.
and if I'm not mistaken, the Big Ten, all the Big Ten platforms that almost everyone uses, like in some countries, basically Facebook is the internet. Like if you buy a
Mm,
phone in many
yeah.
countries, know, socioeconomically poor countries where you're more likely to encounter vulnerable people who would be victims of, trafficking rings or vulnerable resources or archaeological sites or wildlife that could be sought and exploited and smuggled because the market, the market of collectors in the West now knows about them, knows where to get them, and the market's grown to meet that demand. But yet, in the countries where the material or the people are coming from that feed these networks, you have cases where, yeah, Facebook has done deals with many countries' governments to make it like the go-to de facto internet app on a phone you buy, for example. Um, don't ask me to name a specific one right now, but I know it's a decent number. Uh, I've had this issue pop up,
Hmm.
and hopefully nowadays they're taking more steps to address that. But yeah, that's the reach that some of these platforms, especially meta platforms, have.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess now that, like, you have certain, like, companies like Meta that own multiple platforms as well,
Yeah,
it's like sharing.
yeah,
I get in the background, I gather they share information, like,
yeah,
between,
yeah,
like, Instagram and Facebook
yeah,
and all of those. So
yeah.
even more.
Mm. Yeah, so
So,
that's a context. That's how Echo came to be and what we're trying to do and a bit about why.
mhm, yeah, it's all very interesting and important work. So on to specifically the human remains portion of this. So generally speaking, I guess it would depend on countries individually, maybe, but is it illegal to sell human remains specifically online?
Uh, you in part answered the question yourself already. Yes, the big problem we see across the board globally is that laws in each jurisdiction are quite different. Not because between states in the U.S. or like sometimes certainly between countries, and between source countries and demand countries, between uh, countries that might serve as like transit hubs or like what we call source, transit, and demand steps. So it can be on the books in a country, say like Egypt, for example, where no no archaeological artifact or including human remains of all types, mummies, anything you could think of, historic and ancient, since I believe 1824, or well back in the 1800s. It's been a state ownership legislation in that country, and many countries have laws of this type that say to a pretty far in the past date anything known or unknown, any artifacts, human remains, already discovered or not, are by default, by law, property of that country and should not leave the country except for specific permitted loan instances, very narrow definition, right? So you have stuff that violates those laws because it's coming out of the ground and looted recently and smuggled out recently in times of conflict. And then it might go to transit points like Singapore or free ports like the old Geneva free port in Switzerland or many other places that can be either known to be used as a transit point or can be used depending on what the seller and buyer think it will be the easiest or least detectable route to getting from point A to point B. But at the midpoint, the laws could say, oh, well, these antiquities count as heritage and they are legal, but we don't define human remains as heritage. And that, in fact, that's a real big issue across the board in many jurisdictions is that cultural heritage laws, in my opinion, in many instances are not nearly specific enough regarding, you know, human remains. They don't know nowhere near enough uh, state level, regional, or let alone like uh, large regional, like EU regional, for example, legislation says outright that, you know, in the law you are forbidden to acquire, all types of human remains, no matter what time they appeared on the markets, you know, from these cultures, defining, you know, the archaeological time periods, defining, the types that are talked about, because often when these laws are written, A, the fact that a modern day human remains trade exists was unknown, and B, like, when it was suspected or maybe hinted of, like, it was thought as, again, so niche of a niche problem that it was often not considered needed or worth it to specifically write in human remains under definitions of illegal to export or import cultural heritage, or under the definitions of archaeological artifacts, or they were often very much left out of the picture. Many uh, relevant parties, relevant jurisdictions, legislation that should be and are relied on now to be the go-to or binding measures to try and deal with stopping illegal export or imports or returning seized items back to countries of origin. You have real gaps, and that's just made a real problem that if the laws don't talk to each other much or don't agree on the same definitions or terms, then you combine that with how wild west and how freely uh, commerce can be done, and then and items can flow uh, via these platforms. Obviously, someone offline in point A has to get the skull, put it in a box, trick or falsely declare the item at their local post office to get it through X number of steps to get to the buyer. But the meeting's happening online. The payments are happening via encrypted messages and, you know, off-channel discussions. And the growth of that on in these platforms and spaces, the ease with which it's allowed to happen, it's actually encouraged by the algorithm for people to connect that way. Provides a perfect, I don't know, environment for established people to teach newbies. Oh yeah, well, you live in this place. oh, the laws are weak here, or don't worry, like you want to get this item to your address in Ireland. I'm sending it from Mexico. Well, I'll just write it as Halloween decorations, or I'll declare it as a medical specimen when it could be an archaeological skull or a part of a mummy or what have you. Like, I guess the point I'm trying to make is something like this has blown up because of the online world we live in now, and it thrives and continues because the people involved know about and that can actively exploit the mismatch and the gaps in the global laws or measures that are supposed to deal with this. And they're fully aware, in my opinion, that a lot of what, when it comes to human remains at least, very often and a large proportion of what collectors are collecting is not really covered, not really addressed specifically enough in the relevant laws to feel that they have a risk or that they're any kind of risk. The,
Mm.
they feel a lot less at risk these days, I think, than traditional antiquities collectors or some categories of wildlife crime, where you see a lot more discussion about, oh, do you have the right permits for this? Is it legal? Is it like, are you sure you can get that to me? Or there's more bet hedging in those spaces, and at least so far, observably, actively less in amongst the communities that we know of that uh, seek the dead.
Ooh, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Ah, that's okay. Sorry.
Every time.
Right.
So I guess those of us kind of who are osteoarchaeologists or
Yeah.
archaeologists, anthropologists who kind of are in this field are very against the
Uh,
sales of human remains,
uh,
of people having human remains
uh,
in private collections. But
uh,
there are people out there who, general public wise might just think like, oh, it's not that big of a
uh,
deal that, some
yeah.
people have these. So can you maybe give a little overview as to like why it's not great that
Yeah,
these
sure. I
collections are
mean,
being bought and sold and people have
sure,
them in
sure.
private collections?
I mean, I can't, I can't make up everyone's mind for them, nor do I. Everyone, everyone who gets into any kind of collecting, even if it's of cultural heritage or you know animals that they want to captive breed and sell, even if they don't fully know how or from when or where the parent stock of the animal came into their location, etc. Like they often they all themselves will have to do their own due diligence, their own caveat emptor, and ultimately only they can make up their mind. But as you said, we in the professional sphere and me being also an archaeologist who, again, for the last 10 years has become an interdisciplinary trafficking scholar and actively monitors and researches these spaces. Yeah, it's fundamentally, it's not only are you, what we say, like commodifying or what the term I've used before, like fetishizing. In many ways, you're just commodifying, putting a price tag on someone else's ancestors or even your own community's ancestors. So does that jive with you and your own community's beliefs collectively that these people should be laid to rest and stay at rest if they appear on the market and buyer has no way to really trust? They only have basically trust at word of mouth or in good faith that the person is selling them that remains of those skulls or those bones, especially if it's you know, anything that's not a medical specimen, quote unquote. Everything else that would have signs of coming from burials or tombs or catacombs or be archaeological or mummies, what have there's a wide range of remains in this market. You just have to take their word that you know, they know where it came from, that they did their own due diligence. But you see time and time again that people are just selling these again like products, like size of meat, like in some cases literally because they're people who collect wet specimens, organs, which again they like to claim would be all coming out of retired, you know, like retired medical collections, but we know in many cases in the media, for example, have exposed that there's a lot of scam and fraud in funeral homes, dodgy cremation practices that get cremated remains of who knows whom, into private hands, thefts out of mortuaries, thefts out of crypts, thefts out of museum stores. Like we always say, it's the story itself, the skeleton. So ultimately, it's the buyer has to hear and accept and believe the seller's story. So that puts them at great risk, not just the seller at risk for dealing in potentially stolen or illegally looted or illegally imported, exported remains. The buyer then too gets put at risk if that shipment was ever seized and investigated, which is another issue. But so why they shouldn't do it? Well, fundamentally, some people say that, all right, everyone sets their own morals and ethics. And in some ways, that's true. But again, we as professionals always try and argue and understand and make the public appreciate that this goes beyond personal moral and ethics in many books. It's ultimately not just disturbing the rest of the long dead, digging up and violating graves or disturbing crime scenes, as we all talk about so frequently. The loss of archaeological context or historic context can come by the way that some of these remains come onto the market. But ultimately, then, to me, beyond all that, even is why why should anyone ever think it's justifiable to want to literally own parts, usually owning parts of someone else, like, and the way that many of these dealers talk about them, it's a weird double-edged sword. It's like some will say, we admit these are people, like, you just treat them with respect. They're not just oddities; they're people, and yet they'll still sell them to whoever has the best price, sell them to the highest bidder. But then much of the rhetoric in these spaces doesn't even afford them that. They're not people; they're pieces, they're specimens, they're things. And we give again many times they're talking about not just you know clean, quote unquote medical specimens that have been bleached hardware, but as we know, that has this whole the moral and ethics and history of that entire medical bone trade out of China and India has been written about before and is its own big kettle of fish. But I try to argue and talk about in my work that the media and the public needs to understand that the depth and breadth of this bone trade, when you look at it in its broadest sense, what's going on today is a lot more than just these allegedly harmless, you know, medical concepts, which is all nonsense. The argument that somehow it's clean, it has hardware, and it's a medical specimen, somebody makes it right, and washing your hands with it and still be fine now. I disagree wholeheartedly. But that's separate from that sector again that is can only have come onto the market from foul play, from thefts, from stealing of ancestral remains out of from villages in the colonial era. Which again does not just further violence to individuals who might have already met a violent death back in the past and robs communities of their ancestors. You know, again, think of if your family or your community had a revered named ancestor, they knew where they were buried, and you found out that burial has been broken into, the body stolen, and now the head of your great grandfather is sitting on someone's shelf. It's across the board. It goes so far beyond just a clear cut economic issue. There's a market, so you must feed the market. Why is there a market in the first place? You know, like we fundamentally say that there are many things, and in my opinion, that would include any and all types of cultural heritage, entities, and especially human remains, where even if there were clean and clear and properly vetted and checked out, cross jurisdictional, tightly legislated and agreed on ways to have a legal, clean market for human remains without all the historical, ethical, moral, forensic baggage or problems that came with it. Let's say that was possible. Well, why does that need to be owned? To me, there's no real justification for needing to collect the dead. Like I've read and seen and followed discussions and comments and long various permutations in dialogue in these spaces that when we monitor these trades in these online channels. So I've heard all flavors of exploitation and what they call neutralization in criminological speak between buyers and sellers and dealers. Why do you collect? I do it for this reason, that reason, etc. But they're in the market. The more they're in the market, the more committed they become to like identifying with this community, if you will, and thus the more it's the possibility of even considering, well, why do I need to collect, you know, the dead, especially other people's dead? You know, let's be honest, the dead of brown and black communities, which is, at least in some niches of this space, these are where the dead are coming from. Like, and they're talked about in terms that you would imagine died a long time ago, died in the 1800s. The language, the rhetoric, uh, revival, the resurrection, if you will, of some incredibly, by our modern sense, colonial, racist, horrendous means of referring to, you know, literally who they're collecting, which is just
Mm.
serves the purpose of neutralizing the act of doing this enough to then turn them into things to buy. So there's a lot of reasons, obviously. And when we're doing talks on this or try to write about it or speak to the media about it, we always say, well, you know, we can't, if someone has just stumbled across the existence of the human remains trade online and was intrigued or gone to a group or followed an Insta account and started chatting with someone, oh, wow, that's an interesting collection. That's looks cool. Can you tell me anything about it? How do I get my first stall? Ultimately, again, it's going to be up to them. They have to put on their thinking cap, do their due diligence, filter the information they're getting from the potential seller, uh, and try to maybe seek out, other opinions, other sources of knowledge, other perspectives on the reality that underpins this trade, no matter where it's encountered. But it's up to them. But we say in the media that before you leap, you know, double, triple, quadruple think about, you know, you actually need to do this. Why do you actually want to own art of someone else? And then we try to just encourage them to understand that, as we know as professionals, it's much, much more messy and dark and, again, neo-colonial and problematic than just, oh, here's a nice skull on a window in the shop of an antique store, 100 quid. Okay, just take it home along with a lamp or something. It's it will never ever be as simple as buying any other thing because, again, these are not victimless acts. These are not victimless crimes. You are fundamentally justifying yourself and becoming okay with exchanging money for part of the body of someone else. So if someone could do that, then in my opinion, they would need to maybe rethink other aspects of their life as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
I am always curious about like who these people are that like I get it. I can somewhat get it from a seller point of view. Like they make money. So like they could care possibly either way what's going on. They could be selling other illegal things, like to them, a skull is the same as, archaeological artifacts is the same as drugs or guns or, they're just illegal objects that get a high price because they're illegal. But I always wonder from like a buyer point of view, like who are these people? Like why do you want a skull like in your home? Especially like you can get fake skulls that look so real. And if you like are just a general person like who's like, just gonna have it on display in your house, why do you need a real one? Why can't you have a plastic one? Like no one's gonna know the difference. I don't understand what the desire is. Like, it's cool. It's like, great. You know how much damage you've done to have your cool home decor item?
I know. But it's become, I would say, for as we observe for maybe lower and middle tier collectors, people just starting out, it's they might, again, if they are active in the see overlap, of course, with the general oddity sphere, uh, sometimes tattooing shops, you know, don't want to just sell for a plastic skull in the window or a plastic skull of a model for, you know, but they wanted to find a way to get a real one. But, you know, they might not even necessarily start out with, in fact, oftentimes they don't start out with, I want human remains. It's, I'm in the space, the broad oddity space that says, oh, I have, you know, a lot of other cool things that fit that aesthetic, that ethos, some maybe animal remains, which again, uh, the sale of bones, taxidermy, processed animals, insects, etc. in those spaces comes with its own massive moral, ethical, legal, conservation questions, and it's an under-researched component of the wildlife trade as well. Um, but yeah, they might fall into it from like accidental exposure and then be told again by people, by the seller and by people they trust that, oh, you can trust me, it's all legit. Oh, I know, it's totally legal in our area, don't worry about it. The seller might not know that, oh, well, this might be legal, but if I want to import or export this type of remains from this place, well, okay, unbeknownst to them, and then they might pass it on to the buyer. Unbeknownst to the buyer, you might get the waters of legality and uh, criminality and muddy, you know. So again, it's if if someone gets into it only on good faith because they see or follow the right conversations in the right spaces or are talking to people that have pitched themselves, which again is super easy to do in many platforms. You can pitch yourself as a group admin, a rising star, a top expert. Facebook example will give individual profiles these labels, depending on how active they are in these spaces. It doesn't matter if the information they're peddling about the legitimacy, the justification, or the legality of a certain activity is totally wrong. It could be incredibly off base, but if the way that they're encountering and attracting new customers is through the means, and the platform itself, via its algorithm, can boost all their content to say, oh yeah, like trust this person. They're a group expert rising star. They know their stuff. Do they know their stuff? They might not, you know? Um, so we'd say, well, the buyers, if they get into it because they're already part of that aesthetic and they get convinced that this will add to that aesthetic if they just start getting huge range, well, you see that a lot, but that can become a problem. But then you get certain niches within the network, niches within this broader category of bone collecting that they don't mess with any of that. They full stop know that they want to be part of very select circles who collect very specific types of human remains. Often, again, you know, indigenous remains in colonial contexts, archaeological stuff, mummies, uh, what they call Sansa or shrunken heads from Hibaro and Shuar communities in Ecuador. Like there are circles within circles within the broader phenomenon that is the bone trade. So you see this in the same way with any kind of sector of heritage crime or the wildlife trade. The wildlife trade and numerous sub niches, sub trades, same kind of phenomenon. And that's why go back to what I said about Echo that underpins a big part of that motivation that I talked about for why our NGO came together in the first place anyway, because we were all seeing that these niches within niches could form, find each other, connect, find each other's content, do final buying and selling, price negotiations and deals, encrypted messaging, etc. All fundamentally because the same underlying algorithms, the same use of hashtags, the same use of tricks, the same use of rhetoric allowed and encouraged by these platforms, allowed all these little weird subsectors to exist and to grow. Um, yeah, so it's there's the buyers who kind of accidentally would fall into it as a next step in an identity that they already have. There's, but again, there's those who, you probably ask them, they would probably say they identify with anything oddities or goth or anything at all, but they literally just want to amass big collection of, ancient artifacts, ancient human remains, historic. They, people who show off an entire shelf. This is my Dayak shelf from the Dayak people of Borneo. This is my collection of, here's my mummy hands. Here's my, it's some of the scale of some of these collectors is still surprising to me because it's much, much bigger. And collectors who've been at it and have the money and have the connections to be at it for years, for decades, and amass huge collections. It's There's multiple motivations for why buyers get into this, but it all comes down, in my opinion, to what their exposure is to begin with, who the platform connected with starts, or if they go into it like basically they're already established and they just want to buy and sell and trade within their own small sphere of like-minded people uh, around a very specific sub-interest, then they can spend years and years tracking down and finding new, specimen, quote unquote, to feed that specific collecting interest. But again, now with the platforms, you know, this group of collectors could be five people, but one could be in the US, one could be in Canada, one could be in Australia, one could be in Ireland. But it doesn't matter because these platforms in our digital world have totally collapsed the geography of all this. So now none of that matters. It only matters in terms of shipping and can you get the remains from point A to point B offline. But that's kind of like an afterthought in many ways to the fact that now you can find the right people with, at two clicks away, as they say. Yeah.
Mm. So for anyone who this is their first kind of introduction to the sale of human remains online, I'm sure they came into this thinking we were going to talk about the dark web. And it's no, this is Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and the sites that you use every day. And I know, obviously, I'm on a niche aspect of Instagram because my Instagram is very much like archaeology osteo stuff, but I have gotten some of this content before. And you try and report it and everything, but it doesn't always work. So what is it that these big media companies are they doing anything to stop this or?
Yeah. Short answer is no, not really. And even in cases with, again, much bigger, much more reported on, much more well-known sectors of organized crime online, like general antiquities trade or the wildlife trade or drugs. But let's say antiquities and wildlife, because there's the other areas that I'm either do research in or I'm familiar with or probably working with. Like those in all their diversity have been, again, much more in the public eye, in the eye of governments, etc. And many are taking, again, offline and contra to any kind of response or cooperation by the platform. It's the people not affiliated or not behind said platforms that are really trying to push back as much as possible against this. But we find that, especially something like meta platforms, some of the bigger culprits for this, they will they'll give the same canned response of, when exposed, when a trafficking case is exposed in the media and it turns out that the buyer and seller were exchanging stuff over Facebook or a major bust of wildlife happens and social media is involved somehow, which is increasingly common. It reaches the press. They'll often give the same canned, You know, we have the best algorithm detection in the business, but we detect over 90% of all content. You know, we take down things if they're brought to our attention. And we have responded by taking down the accounts that were brought to light in this story or something like that. What you don't know is that, as I'm sure many of us have a sense is the case from reporting other kind of violating content, like random thirst trap accounts that'll pop up. We all seen that. Right? Same kind of thing. It's the spotlight will be on them for a few days. They'll put a statement out saying, "Yep, we're the best. Like we've done X, Y, and Z." As soon as the spotlight's gone, many of those accounts can pop right back up because there's no IP blocking, no IP address checking. They'll say, "Oh yes, like we continuously moderate, our detection of certain keywords of relevance to this category." But if they do it at all, it might only be in English, so it often ignores, trafficking done on non-English language channels or networks on these platforms. It doesn't take into account that many times, emojis or hashtags are used. If one hashtag is blocked, and you just, oh, change. We see this all the time in the motion, I'll write human, Human, I'll write HOOMAN, I'll write H0MAN, I'll spell it out with emojis, I'll write the price like in Photoshop on the picture itself, you know, so you don't have to list the price in text. I'll do all the negotiations. And again, against global law enforcement's, you know, stringent requests and to their ultimate horror, right? A few years ago, Meta made its messaging all and encrypted. WhatsApp, Messenger, private Insta. That means all the final negotiations between buyer and seller of eventually dodgy or illegal item or the sale of a person or what have you. You don't have to do that in the open anymore. You can just go to Messenger and they'll say, PM me, price requests in Messenger, price requests in details. Now some people are also moving to Telegram, the somewhat deeper channels as well. But yeah, it's the platforms really have a long track record, as Echo Rook will show, and it's working with many, many other people across a wide range of studies of online crime. Cross-sector will show. They talk big, but when push comes to shove, very, very little is actually done to meaningfully reduce and or prevent reoccurrence of these individuals, the networks that they form, and they know, and that's the frustrating thing. By now, again, across types of every type of trafficking, the networks involved know that if they go onto these platforms, then they understand that there's very little bark in the bite, or bite in the bark, whatever they say. And so again, it's just another way that they can feel decently. It's weird. They feel decently safe on the one hand, knowing that little repercussions will happen. Yet simultaneously, the more the media is written on the bum trade or other types of things, the more exposure has happened. You see an increase in people saying, "Ah, you gotta be careful. Do it this way. Only use PayPal goods and services or like friends and family. Uh, you know, ship it like this. Use these terms. You know, we're pretty sure that law enforcement is watching us. You know, let's we got to be careful. So use this trick or use that trick." They fear exposure and detection from outside more than they ever do platform internal enforcement. I think, in my opinion, I'd argue that that's observation is correct, and it certainly matches what I'm seeing.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't study this. I don't study any of this, but even just from a user of the platforms who's like on the outskirts of this stuff just because of the things that I follow. Like, obviously, I'm not buying or selling anything, but
Sure,
because I look up human remains and archaeology, like
sure.
sometimes these stuff popped up.
Yeah,
And like you
yeah,
can see some of these people have like huge followings and everything, and it's very blatant on it, like what
yeah,
they're doing. So you're like,
yeah.
it's very clear that like the platform internally somehow like has to know what's going on. Is there a reason why they're not bothered to like block IP addresses or like to really crack down beyond being like, I'm gonna ban this username, but if you add a 1, I'll let you back on tomorrow?
Money, again, go back to what I said about the uh, Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act and legal liability shield. They know that basically until that changes or is meaningfully reformed or repealed, we argue for reform. It has its benefits, so it needs to be reformed to carve out and get rid of the protection that the platforms have from this kind of stuff. Because with that in place, then yeah, they don't have to change their ways at all. Really. Like it's really up to them what they do, how much they do, if they do it, and they understand that the more people using the services, especially these days, just things like usership of Facebook. At least I think by Facebook, but my understanding, general usership around the world is massively declining among like lower generations. They're all moving to TikTok, Snapchat. I mean, all these platforms have major issues with content and moderation, but where networks that allow buying and selling on platforms that were not originally designed for buying and selling, like meta platforms, they've added those features in. They understand that the more they allow it, that means the more ad revenue they can show and get. Dealers can get ad revenue as well by having ads, you know, pop up next to their content. They, again, they deliberately put in or change the features that make this easier. Uh, and but it all collectively stems back to they don't really change anything because they don't feel they ever have to. You know, like they know that, and when the founder, like Zuckerberg himself, is a quintuple super billionaire, and that's across the board for many of these platforms too. Like it's they feel permanently shielded by how much wealth they have, so how much influence they can peddle. That there's no real binding legal mechanism in place to force meaningful action on this stuff yet, on any of this stuff, and that letting it flourish is fine for business. And then they can also go to the media and say, well, we don't want to hurt small businesses. We want small businesses to have, their business pages and have homes on our platforms and with not distinguishing between, you know, a grandma selling knitted shawls by a Facebook page that her grandson set up is rather different than, you know, someone actively peddling Egyptian mummy hands and, you know, looted remains stolen out of a church in England or something. It's they're not the same thing. They're not equal. It's
Yeah. Your small business selling candles is not the same as someone's small business selling grandma's skull.
yeah,
Very,
right.
very different small
You think that's
business.
pretty obvious, but it's complicated. I can't pretend to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Like, and to really answer something like this, we'd have to dive into a lot of other categories of research, advocacy, etc. I can only speak towards what I've observed, what my research has shown about the areas of online crime I've actually studied and become knowledgeable about. But I don't pretend to think that the mechanisms, the underlying problem of poor moderation and lack of incentive to moderate underpins everything. Mm, But the way networks work, the way buyers and sellers connect, specific tricks that they might use will be different between, between broad categories of organized crime or broad buying and selling networks or broad spheres of types of item, specifically, and then even within something like the human domain trade or activity trading, like the go-to people, the keywords or codes to use, the emojis to use, the groups to be in, the private accounts to follow for, I don't know, let's say ancient Southeast Asian bronze items will be different than human remains, will be different than buyers and sellers of rare orchids or what have you. You know, it's what I'm trying to argue is, again, circling back to uh, that underlying observation that allowed an ACCO to form is that the specific tricks will be different, but the stage of those tricks can be on is the same. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's clear, I think. I hope.
Yeah, that I feel like that. Yeah, that kind of like sums it up
Nice,
very
snappy,
well.
summed up thing. Yes.
Mhm. So you're mentioning that like this legal liability shields law that protects these companies, that needs to be changed in order to try and
Right.
start fixing this sort of issue. Is that like the big thing that needs to be changed? Are there other things involved in this that we need to be doing to
Well,
kind of like
yeah,
crack down on this trade?
yeah. I mean, especially given it now, unfortunately, especially since this year, it just seems like we fear that real progress on this might be a long, long time coming. If you will. We don't know, but it certainly looks a lot different in terms of the landscape for reform now, given all that's happening versus 2018 when we started. But yeah, but no, the public and professionals can do quite a lot. Obviously, the more that you report listings you see before, the more you report, the better. Even if nothing is taken down because it doesn't violate community standards, but also always that will never cease to amaze me and infuriate me really. Platforms like again, meta platforms, go to the terms of service. What's forbidden? Historical and ancient artifacts, human remains. They say that wildlife of all types, living or products, all should be forbidden. All these things that we see are directly against their own terms of service, and yet it's never enforced. So there's that. Um, and but the more you record it, the better, you know. But more importantly than that, because even if nothing comes to the recording, you screen grab it, you capture it, you save it, and then, you know, if you're in a professional bioarchaeologist or forensic practitioner, and it's involving a possible sale in your local area, then you can get it to the attention of local police or the coroners or the local museum. Um, it's at the very least that will accomplish putting that seller on the radar of relevant authorities. So then we'll hopefully be able to, even if I can't stop that sale, because you might see it, you might see the post, you know, a day or a week after the sales are
Mm.
gone through, and they'll say edit sold or what have you. These oftentimes when especially things like human remains are listed, you see them get snapped up pretty fast. But at least you can get some of these crime offenders that relevant to your area, bring them, look up who the relevant authorities are, or in law enforcement or civilian authorities, and at least just say, hey, I'm a professional. I have these credentials. I recognize this is, you know, real human remains. B, if you can say anything about what you see in the photo, uh, even a very basic, very broad age and sex estimate, or any taphonomic indicators that you can observe just off the top of your head that could give a sense of what kind of original burial deposition this was, what kind of maybe an idea of possible age or time period. Um, any information you give, any context you give to reconnect some humanity to that post and then pass that on to authorities as professionals, that's always going to be useful. And I do it too, and I found that, oftentimes it's one of the few things you can do to feel like you're having a immediate moment by moment kind of impact. Um,
Hmm.
and but, just casual listeners or civilians or general platform users who care about this topic can also do the same. It's um, and really because so much of this can pop up, you know, in these spaces. I think you kind of feel fast and curious as to if you're looking in the right places, how often you see it, but you just have to accept that you can focus on or maybe pull out or capture and report maybe the ones that seem to be at first glance potentially the most problematic or that have maybe in your individual or professional opinion would have the most possibility of catching the authority, the immediate attention, saying, "Hey, that shouldn't be sold. You know, this is in our jurisdiction." Especially if you want to look up possible relevant legislation, or as a professional, uh, have access to links to things like relevant tissue acts or anatomy acts or other permanent cemetery legislation, what have you, that you think would fit what you're seeing in that post, the more you can give uh, anyone you report it to from the beginning, the more likely it might be for them to take notice and write back to you and say, okay, thanks for telling us. And at least they can then maybe monitor this person, or if their account shows that they have a offline shop or other offline presence where they sell at or acquire, then maybe at least putting them on the radar to say, okay, now there's a greater chance that maybe shipments to them might be flagged, or uh, they'll be maybe watched a bit more closely. And then it's up to the authorities then to determine what they can do within the confines of current law. And it just depends. Then it depends. It goes back to what I said about jurisdictional mismatch. But as civilians, at least as professional practitioners, at least we can be that first step. And shameless plug, but if you so do, feel free to attach some of my research, uh, links to my research, because as I do myself, the more context I have about the bigger problem, the better.
Hmm. Yes, and we will have links
Yeah,
to all of your research in the description. So if anyone wants to
not
use
just
that
my
in
research,
your
but
reaching out.
yeah, and there's other many other good folks who are doing good work in this space too. So Google and Google Scholar is your friend for thankfully there's a growing number of us who are building on each other's work and trying to increase that data driven public awareness and increase that data driven ability to push back where we can, even if it sometimes seems like a Sisyphean uphill battle of a task. We can, you know, it's you got to be in it to win it. It's always going to be better in doing nothing.
Mm. And I know for anyone interested, I do know that there are some
Mm.
professional osteology groups.
Yep,
Like I know in the UK, the Babio group have
yep,
a subgroup that
yep.
is people who monitor these online sales and report them and send reports and stuff. So I know
Um,
there are groups people can join if they want
yeah,
to do
I
more about
am
this.
I am one of the co-founders of that group. Uh, I am the
I
only
keep meaning to
non
join and I never do.
yeah, me too. I'm the only non-UK based and non-British individual in that group because of my background in this area. But yes, definitely the Babao group. If you're in the UK at all, that's very highly recommended. Um, I'm not just a client, but I'm a member. Um, so yes, we have actually fortunately had a decent track record now of success in when either we find or others flag for us live auction listings, only auction listings, because when it's auction listings that pop up online, in that case, then professionals like the Web Out Group or like you yourself could do, any professional could do, then you can directly try to write to the auction house itself. Give your some of your background, and a bit about what you see, why that should be for sale, uh, especially in the cases of historic or archaeological or indigenous remains, which I know that the UK is actually and very encouragingly trying to change your legislation to uh, trying to really curtail your marketing, which would be phenomenal if or when that can happen. But in the meantime, yeah, let's professionals especially. There's a venue, the writing to auction houses or the trying to get communication with these vendors directly uh, to ask them to withdraw the lot from auction or to and not just give the item back to the consigner, but like the Bao Group does, attach to it a list of institutions, universities or museums in the UK that uh, are able and have agreed to be able to possibly accept uh, public donations. So if the auction house pulls the lot from auction, gives it back to the consigner, if the consigner then can be convinced to do the right thing, then at least if the remains in question can't be automatically repatriated, uh, and sometimes they can't, then at least they'll be off the markets and not on someone's shelf somewhere. So, yes, that's absolutely a venue, at least in certain countries where you see a lot of auctions, like the UK is one of them. Here in Australia, not so much, um, but definitely the UK, Ireland, the EU, that part of the world has unfortunately a decent number of auction houses online and offline that still sell quite a wide variety of human remains. So it's there another avenue where professionals in those locations can join the fight.
Yeah, I know here in Ireland, we've been trying to introduce, like in the UK, they've the Human Tissue Act around, like you can't have certain things on display, you can't own certain things. And I know we're trying to introduce one in Ireland. I don't think it's as robust as the one in the UK, but the hope is that once that's introduced, we can do more to like stop auctions and stuff. Because at the moment, technically, it's like there's no rule that says you can't do this. But we're like, well, bring one in, and then we'll create our own little subgroup where we go after these people. You made a good point.
Like in the absence of legislation, whether something is legal, moral, or ethical or not comes down, well, okay, in the absence of legislation, everything is legal by default, including activities that most people would find morally and ethically quite objectionable. Because you can't reasonably expect to legislate moral or ethical changes in society. All you can do is legislate against a certain activity. Again, it has to be that specific. We will make it illegal to buy and sell human remains in this jurisdiction, these types of remains, these ages, or however you want to word it, but it has to be specific enough to close all the loopholes that people can find to get around it. And then it's up to society or the buyers and sellers in question to either comply with the law or face the consequences. And in so doing, complying with the law, then it's up to them to maybe rethink their morals and ethics around this. But if they don't, if they are still convinced that, buying and selling human remains is fine, should be allowed, should be cool, then it's up to them to then find a way to do that within the law. But the laws have to be tighter and in place first.
Yeah, it's hard to be like, ethically, that's wrong. Legally, you're doing nothing wrong.
Yeah. And then, in my opinion, and I think globally speaking, doing something about the human rights trade is such a mess. Again, because of mismatch. But that mismatch, in my opinion, really stems from the fact that the existence of, a modern day, global, private collecting, private market for human remains outside of that collecting community itself. I mean, awareness of it by the media, by the public, by professionals. Again, it's only, I won't say I'm not going to say it's done with my colleagues' work, but it's really, 2017, you wrote about Instagram, the first academic paper that anyone ever put out on any bone related thing was in 2003 on the eBay market of that day, of those days. So it's 20 years old, just a bit over 20 years old. That's a real drop in the bucket compared to how much knowledge there's been about you know, the deep the deep antiquity of the antiquity period, or how long uh, things like uh, wildlife smuggling of all types have existed, or even just awareness of modern online driven or internet driven permutations of these other types of bigger, more economically vast, more high profile types of trafficking. They had the benefit of being exposed and exposed and researched for a lot longer, which is counteracted by the fact that they're much bigger and more messy. But bone trade has had the kind of the opposite problem of a much shorter history of people being aware of it outside of the community, which has caused then the laws of all the relevant jurisdictions and locations to now really have to be playing catch up and are really, really kind of behind the time of the reality that this is not just something that's assigned to the Victorian era, that this is a really a revival in many ways of these colonial attitudes. Because they're using the same rhetoric. They're setting up, some collectors set up their like home and their display cabinets to look the same way, to look like a Wunderkammer. They go for that aesthetic. Like they talk about the remains in many ways in the same way that you'd expect in someone's ex- explorer looter's diary out of the 1800s. It's everything old is new again, and because of that, what to do about it and how to address it is, yeah, it's we're still struggling to catch up.
It's
Deep
definitely
thoughts, deep topics.
yeah, it's definitely a very broad global topic. Definitely very difficult to
Yeah.
pinpoint. Like this is the one problem, one solution. Everything's tied up in a neat
No,
little
no, no,
bow. It's
no.
not the way these things work.
Yeah, and that's why, well, in my own work and by my own opinion, I think all all illicit trafficking research inherently has to be interdisciplinary. You can't just.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is so messy, and the various angles and aspects of the problem and how it functions and what to do about it are complicated enough that you need the knowledge, not just subject matter knowledge from biology, forensic anthropology, or osteology in general, but yeah, you know about how platforms function, aspects of economics, like um, you need to have a really some awareness of relevant policy and law, but then you have to be able to find the experts in these areas too to talk to. When you don't know the answer to something, you go to a lawyer, you go to a professional X, Y, or Z, but it has to be, sorry, yeah, it has to be that kind of amplification of force, if you will.
Well, it's interesting actually that you mentioned talking to lawyers, because I was just interviewing someone on Thursday who is a lawyer who's studying the repatriation of hominin fossils and the laws around how people take fossils, where they come from, how they end up in museums, and if they end up getting returned. So this is all very tied together. If anyone's interested, that episode will either be up the week before or the week after this one. So we've got a little mini series on legal archaeology and osteology going on.
To feed into that, I have seen examples of alleged hominin remains in private collections.
Yeah,
so
I can imagine.
It's not just a state level ownership, colonial nefarious activity slash what's the legality of repatriation today, kind of from museum questions. I don't think anyone knows or even try to really try and figure out or long term study what a private market for this material would look like. All I can say is I've seen examples.
I do also wonder, how much history and like knowledge and stuff we're losing from people just like having stuff in private collections.
Yeah, that's a real horrifying question there, isn't it? It's not just all that context is lost, but just it's communities again are you know losing losing direct access to their ancestors in many ways that you would define that. Even even if remains that have been circulating between collections for decades and gone from private dealer to private dealer, like even if it'd be very very difficult to get those back to community unless they're seized in transit, um, you still like that doesn't allow for or cause anyone to expect that the descending communities would be okay with, oh, it's not in a museum, so let's just have it be in someone's living room. No, like that's a worse problem in my opinion. Like, and a much harder one to deal with because at least a museum is an institution that communities can connect to, have dialogue with, etc. You really don't see that much with private collectors unless they're forced to, unless they have very specific reason to. It's unfortunately the attitude as we've observed it is, I paid the money for it, I collected it, it's and it's become part of my identity and persona and ethos of like I want to be known around the world as a go-to person for the acquiring of this type of remains, and so yeah, the very few instances I've ever seen of like a private collector de-accessioning their collection, and whether those items went to professional public institutions or back to communities or what is either you know, law enforcement has seized material and the big investigations happen and then their whole collections been seized and researched and dispersed, or they died and family then just dispersed it off to other collectors willy nilly, uh, or they acquire something that's turned out to be you know too hot to handle, and then they were approached by the right people or approached by community, then they were convinced to maybe we'll give it back to the place it was stolen from or the people it was stolen from, but usually we'll give it back if you basically give us the money back. So again, it's like extra problematic and extra icky phenomenon of a country or a community having to buy back its heritage. And now think about it this way: we hear about those cases in the antiquities repatriation world where you know a museum will repatriate an item that came out of colonial looting or recent looting, uh, but they want to send it back before law enforcement gets involved and the community gets in touch with them and say, can we do this, you know, mano a mano, if you will, and leave law enforcement out of it per se. Okay, yeah, we'll do it, but give us the money. Give us X amount of money and then we'll give it back. But we as professionals say, all right, that's icky enough. That shouldn't be how it is. Now imagine doing that and having to buy back your own literal ancestors, to buy back some bones of your old ones. And again, that's unfortunately remains returning to where they're supposed to be after being X amount of years or decades in private collections. In my opinion, and again, my knowledge is a much, much less common occurrence than regular antiquities having that same successful fate. And it all stems again back to partly the fact that, again, just general global collective awareness across the board. And unfortunately, that includes awareness by descendant communities sometimes that the collection of their own ancestors is still a thing. Because, that, I mean, and in some cases where I've spoken about this to certain descendant communities in my research, and I was told, like, oh, yeah, we had no idea that, like, we thought this was just you know, colonial days. We knew that, colonial collectors had taken lots of our items or our dead, our ancestors, but when we show them, no, like these are people selling what they claim to be your community's ancestors right there on Facebook, you know, it's always horrifying and shocking because it's it's unbelievable because it shouldn't have to be a believable thing, you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can go on and on
It's
about this.
well, it's also just as you're talking there, like it dawns on me that it must be very difficult as well to like say to these people, like private collectors, like you shouldn't have these. You should return them to the their descendants,
Yeah,
like where they're from. When museums have the same things, like to be like
yes, and
this big institution has
yeah,
also stolen stuff.
yeah,
They're not
and
returning it, but we expect you, an individual,
yeah,
to.
and that's why in many instances, you know, many of my colleagues and I, we know that's the case. There's we know it's kind of a lost cause to try and as transparent professionals to say to collectors, like, hey, you should give this back. Not only we know that often doesn't work, but furthermore, in these online spaces that we all observe, for again for a variety of things, you see that exact discussion, like the story of recent thefts out of museums that have made the news. Like yesterday, there was one out of the Bristol Museum, um, or rain damage of the Louvre, damaging archives and artifacts, or all the high profile things that have occurred, plus all the stories of museums being brought to task and having to repatriate or agreeing to repatriate and updating their policy. All those are discussed also in these private collecting spaces. And they'll often, you do see that exact same rhetoric of, like, you know, you know, why should we change when these institutions are only starting to change? Or like, oh, these institutions are giving things back you know, to places. They're all woke. Like, uh, you know, that's, they'll come up with arguments around that, but it boils down to, like, oh, they're just bending the knee to public pressure. But if if these human remains weren't in my collection on my shelf, then oh, they'd just be reburied or destroyed, or you know, there's what's the good work of a colleague Lauren Dudler wrote about a few years ago on dealer personas, or the images, the specific types of image that antiquities and human remains and dealers, heritage in general, there's certain categories that they'll try and pitch themselves as, you know, I'm the expert, or I'm the savior, or you know, I'm the go-to person. Uh, I'm gonna say like, I'm the designated, like, I don't know, they almost see themselves as like a designated subject matter expert in their own right, just by virtue of maybe the sheer number of a certain type of, category of human domain, or a certain type of antiquity that has passed their hands. But at the same time, the internet allows everyone to kind of be or claim their own expertise, and yet they'll also, amongst themselves, like verbally go to battle with, you know, the attitudes of professionals of the other side. Well, oh well, why should we do it when they're not doing it? Or, all these cases show that, you know, even museums can't take care of things properly. But and if I keep it in my private home, I'm not saving it. That justifies everything, you know, and everything, every other concern, every other issue, or the legality or criminality of the very acquisition itself falls by the wayside. Criminologists call it neutralization techniques. It's a really interesting area of research.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, this has been a very interesting conversation on a
I,
very broad topic. I feel like you've
thank
done a
you.
very good job of
Thank you.
explaining
That's been
it
great to
all.
talk about it, as always.
Is is there anything that we haven't discussed that you feel like people should know?
um, no, I think in a general sense, you've been very thorough. But I'm sure if any of your listeners have offer comments or questions, I guess I'll follow the YouTube channel when the podcast is released. I can maybe find a way to respond to any questions that might pop up there, or if you get any yourself as a host, feel free to pass them on, and
Mm-hmm.
if we can find a way to have good dialogue with the public after the fact, if anyone wants to chat about any of this further, or concerns, comments, critiques, likes, what have you, yeah, I'm happy to keep keep spreading the good word with those who show that they've actually thought about and really care like me about this problem. So
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
thank you,
This has
Megan.
been
I
a
really appreciate it.
very interesting conversation. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in. I hope you have all gotten on board with fighting the good fight
Yes.
on this one. And I will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, everybody.